I remember the first time I saw the letter. It wasn't one of those official-looking envelopes you might expect in a P.O. box. No, it was far stranger than that. When it showed up, it looked so personal. The handwriting was unmistakable. I knew it right away. Will. Even though I didn't want to acknowledge it, deep down I knew it was him. The very peculiar way he wrote the letters, especially the A's and I's. And, weirdly enough, even the way he'd write my username had become ingrained in my mind. I couldn't help it. There was this gnawing curiosity, an itch I couldn't scratch, pulling me toward the envelope. So, with a deep breath, I tore it open. My hands were shaking a little. Why did I even let myself feel this way? I knew what was inside. It's like part of me already understood, but I just couldn't stop myself from looking. I almost wish I hadn't. The letter started like the others before. Will talked about art, his passion for creativity, the artists who inspired him, and how he was working on projects. He always had something new he was pursuing. But as I read on, the tone shifted. Toward the end, he got personal. Too personal. Will confessed his feelings for me. And not just in a "hey, I think you're cool" kind of way. No, it was deeper, darker. He wrote that his feelings had grown stronger than any he'd ever had for a friend or sister. That he was more in love with me than he ever thought possible. I felt sick reading it. This wasn't just admiration. This was obsession. He poured his heart out, talking about how our connection had started, how it had developed, how it had become an all-consuming fire that burned inside him, and how he could no longer contain it. By the time I got to the last few paragraphs, I couldn't stomach it anymore. My head was spinning. His words were so intense, so passionate, so completely out of touch with reality. It was as though he had convinced himself we were already in a relationship. Like everything he wrote wasn't just fantasy. The intensity of it, it was too much. I couldn't finish reading it, but I knew I had to. I skimmed through the rest of it, trying to get it over with. But then, I saw it. At the bottom of the page, he had attached a picture. Of me. It wasn't just any picture, though. This was something I had feared for so long. It was an image of me, naked with a large round pregnancy belly sticking out from my body. I stared at it, horrified as the reality of it all sank in, and there, standing behind me, was Will. He was drawn with his hands on my stomach, cupping it like we were a family. He had titled it, Our Future. I felt my stomach churn. It was as if everything inside me froze. I couldn't look away from the picture, but I wanted to burn it. I wanted to tear it up. Instead, I shoved both the letter and the drawing into the kitchen trash bin. Then, I just sat there, frozen, staring at nothing. My body was there, but my mind was somewhere far, far away. My mom came into the kitchen, sensing something was wrong. I couldn't hold it together. I broke down, tears flooding my eyes. She didn't ask many questions, but her face told me she understood. We sat down at the table, and I explained as best as I could. I showed her the letter, and she read it, her expression growing more and more worried as she did. She sighed heavily when she finished. You can't let people like this ruin the good things you have. Famous people, they attract weirdos, you know. It's just something you have to get used to. But keep yourself safe, okay? That's what matters. Her words were kind, but I could still feel the weight of it all. It wasn't as simple as that. I had to keep moving forward, but I knew I couldn't keep replying to Will's letters, couldn't engage with him anymore. I had to shut him out. So, I did. I carried on. I kept uploading videos. I kept making content. I didn't reply to his letter. I didn't acknowledge him in any way. For a while, it felt like it was working. I went back to my usual routine, hoping that the weirdness would fade. But it didn't. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. Will had commented on one of my latest videos. His comment had dozens of replies. I read them, heart sinking in my chest. Will was angry. He was complaining about how I hadn't replied to his letter, how I hadn't even thanked him for the drawing. It was absurd. But what really made my skin crawl was the fact that he was playing the victim, trying to guilt me for not responding. The commenters defending me just made him angrier. Will had a way of stirring up conflict, and it felt like that was his real goal. He wasn't just trying to connect with me, he was trying to manipulate the situation. He wanted attention, no matter what kind it was. I didn't want to get involved, but it was hard to ignore. The fact that he would do this publicly, dragging it out in front of my other subscribers, made me furious. But still, I kept my silence. I didn't reply. Instead, I took advice from an ASMR creators group I was part of. I found out there was a way to block users from commenting on my videos entirely. I could filter out their comments, and they wouldn't know. So I did it. I blocked him. It worked. For a time. I thought I had solved the problem. I blocked Will, and for a few weeks there was peace. There were no more comments, no more creepy drawings, no more letters. I felt like I had taken control of the situation. Will had been silenced, and it was a relief. The weight lifted, and I could breathe again. It was almost like I had won. But then, just as I started to let my guard down, something happened. One day I received a postcard. My heart dropped the second I saw the envelope. It wasn't thick like a letter, but I knew exactly who it was from. The handwriting. I didn't even have to open it. My stomach twisted as I realized that Will had found a new way to contact me. Again. John. I took the postcard out of the envelope slowly. I could already feel my hands trembling. There was a picture of a beautiful sunset on one side, some generic postcard you could pick up in any tourist shop. But on the back, it was short, simple, and the words sent a chill down my spine. I know what you did. Just 5 words, but they were enough to make my blood run cold. I could almost hear Will's voice in my head, the same tone he used in his letters, only this time it felt different. It wasn't just an expression of love or obsession. This felt like a threat. It wasn't just a message. It was a warning. But I wasn't surprised. Somewhere deep down I had known this was coming. Will wasn't someone who would just walk away quietly. He wouldn't just let it go. He was obsessed. And this was his way of reminding me he was still out there, still watching, still involved in my life, no matter how much I tried to push him away. At that moment I was angry. I was frustrated, and I was scared, but I was also ready. I had prepared myself for this kind of fallout. I knew how to handle him now. I could block him on my YouTube, my email, my social media. It was just a matter of time before he got bored and moved on. At least that's what I thought. A few weeks passed, and Will seemed to disappear again. No postcards, no letters, no comments. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe he really had moved on. Maybe I had finally gotten rid of him. But life, as it turns out, doesn't like to let you have that peace for long. One day I got a text alert from the post office. A package had arrived at my P.O. box. My stomach churned again. I had been receiving a few things here and there, including a lovely orange octopus that a subscriber had knitted for me. But this time felt different. I had a bad feeling. The alert didn't specify what the package was, but I was on edge. I'd been through too much with Will, and now, with the thought of him being out there, I couldn't help but imagine the worst. What if it was a strange gift? A disgusting letter? Maybe something even more sinister. When I went to pick it up, the woman behind the counter looked at me differently than she had before. She was nice, as usual, but her expression had changed. There was a nervousness in her eyes, like she knew something I didn't. She asked me to confirm my P.O. box number, which was strange because I had never had to do that before. She seemed fine at first, but then she started acting more cautious, almost like she was keeping her distance. I tried not to think too much of it, but then she asked if we could speak privately. My heart sank as I realized what this was about. I just knew. It was Will. We stepped aside, and she looked at me like she was about to tell me something important, something I wasn't going to like. She told me that just a few hours ago a man had come in, asking for my P.O. box number. He had a letter for me, but when she asked him for some details, he got pushy. He wanted to know who rented the box, how often they came to collect their mail, and what days they usually came in. She said it felt off. When she refused to give him any information, he got aggressive, demanding to know more. He claimed that the person who rented the box was a close friend of his, and that he needed to find them. But when she questioned why he didn't know my name if they were such close friends, he left in a hurry. It wasn't until later, after the man had left, that she realized the situation was more serious than she initially thought. She had kept the letter, knowing it probably had his fingerprints on it, and planned to turn it over to the police. I could feel the color drain from my face as I stood there, hearing her recount the encounter. Will had been to the post office. He had been trying to track me down, trying to find out where I was when I came to pick up my mail. I thought back to the postcard, the message he'd written. I know what you did. What had I done? I had blocked him. I had silenced him. I had shut him out. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The worst part, the most disturbing part, I realized that he could do this again. He could track me down in real life. He could show up at my door. He could show up at the post office again. There was nothing stopping him. I felt a surge of panic, And shame. I had thought that by blocking him, by stopping the communication, I was done with it. But I wasn't. I realized I'd underestimated him. I had allowed him to get too close, and now he knew more than he should. And so I gave up. I decided I wasn't cut out for this. The constant worry, the creeping feeling that someone was always watching, it was too much. I could tell myself I was strong enough to handle it, that I could push through it, but deep down I knew it wasn't true. I deleted my channel. I shut everything down. All my hard work, my videos, my creativity, all of it just vanished. I had to protect myself, and that meant disappearing. It felt like a weight was lifted, but a part of me still felt guilty. I felt like I had let fear win. I had let Will win. But in the end, what else could I do? I couldn't keep living like that, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if today was the day Will would find me again. I moved on with my life. I went back to my normal 9-to-5 job. But I can't forget. I can't forget what it felt like to be watched, to be stalked, to be obsessed over. It's always in the back of my mind, and every time I think about starting something new, I remember that drawing he did of me, the one with the pregnant belly. Back in high school, I had a couple of close friends, Ben and Eli. We were tight, did almost everything together. Growing up in a small town, it felt like we knew every corner of our world, but that also meant we dreamed of seeing something more. When graduation came, though, everything changed. Ben's family packed up and moved to Cedar Falls, North Carolina, because of his dad's work. Eli and I were pretty bummed. We didn't know what life would be like without our trio, but Ben promised we'd keep in touch. A few months later, Ben invited us to visit his new place for the weekend, so we hit the road to Cedar Falls. Ben's house was tucked away, surrounded by these thick woods and a river that cut through the countryside, twisting like a silver thread between the trees. It was peaceful, quiet, and felt like a whole other world compared to our hometown. Ben mentioned a hiking trail that followed the river, so we figured we'd go explore. After all, what's the worst that could happen? We set out, following the river and chatting about everything that happened since we'd last seen each other. The trail felt like it would go on forever, winding through trees that seemed to press closer as we went further. After a while, we realized we'd lost track of where we were. No idea if we were going upstream or downstream, and it was starting to get late. Every direction looked the same, just trees and shadows stretching on and on. We called out, hoping maybe someone else was out there, but our voices just got swallowed up by the woods. After a long stretch of silence, we spotted something in the distance. It was an old building, looked like a church. The red bricks were weathered and covered with ivy, windows broken or missing. The dirt lot was overgrown with weeds, but there were a few old cars, relics from the 70s or 80s, parked out front. They were rusted and broken down, like they'd been abandoned there and forgotten. But then, something strange caught our attention. We could hear gospel music coming from inside, faint, like it was playing on an old record. The voices sounded distant, almost dreamlike. It was eerie. But after all this walking, the idea of finding other people was a relief. We thought maybe we could use a phone and call Ben's parents to come get us. We pushed the door open, and the music stopped instantly. Inside, we saw about 20 people sitting in the pews. They were dressed in what looked like their Sunday best, though everything they wore was old and worn. An elderly woman, her hair snowy white, sat at a piano near the front, her fingers frozen over the keys, staring at us with these unreadable eyes. Everyone in that room turned to look at us, faces expressionless, eyes empty. It was like we'd walked into something secret. Eli, ever the talkative one, tried to break the silence. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice shaking just a little. "We're lost and need to call for help. Can we borrow a phone?" Nothing. Not a word, not a nod, just that same heavy silence. I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding loud in my ears. Slowly, we backed away, letting the door swing shut behind us. As soon as we were outside, we exchanged a look. This place wasn't right. We turned toward the dirt road, figuring it had to lead somewhere, and we could try to find our way back to Ben's. After a few minutes, Eli whispered something that made my skin crawl. There were no crosses or anything. "Did you see that?" "Just nothing." I hadn't noticed at first, but he was right. No symbols, no signs. Nothing that marked it as a church at all. Just then, we both looked back. A group of people had stepped out from the church, maybe a dozen men, all standing there silently, just watching us. We didn't need to discuss what to do next. We just ran, feet pounding the dirt as we sprinted down the road, hearts racing with a fear we couldn't quite explain. We didn't stop running for what felt like half an hour, maybe more. The trees pressed in tight around the road, and shadows stretched out like fingers, reaching to pull us back. Finally, out of breath, we saw an old gas station up ahead. Relief hit me like a wave. It was one of those full-service stations, the kind you don't see anymore, with faded paint and a sign that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Inside, the shelves were mostly empty and covered in dust. Behind the counter sat a man who looked like he'd been there forever, worn cap, skin darkened by years of sun, and a thin, crooked smile that made me feel uneasy. He was reading some beat-up old book, its pages yellow and torn. He looked up, giving us a slow once-over. "You boys lost, huh?" he drawled, his voice like gravel. "Yeah," Ben stammered. We got turned around by the river and ended up near this old church building. We just need directions back to the main road, sir." The man's smile didn't waver, but his eyes seemed to flicker with something. "The church, huh?" he said, almost like he was amused. "Just head out the way you all came in, take a left, and follow that road until you see a telephone pole. Make a right there, and you'll hit a trail that leads to the highway." We nodded, mumbled our thanks, and turned to go. But something about that place, something about that man lingered like a weight in the air. As we stepped outside, I glanced back. He was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, that same unsettling grin on his face. I felt a shiver go down my spine. The three of us walked quickly, glancing back every so often to make sure he hadn't followed. After a while, we found the telephone pole he mentioned. We took the right turn, and as we walked down the narrow trail, the trees began to thin. The night was starting to settle in, the sky a deep shade of purple, and soon enough, stars began poking through. At last, we stumbled onto the highway, feeling like we'd somehow stepped back into the real world. We tried flagging down cars as they sped past, but no one stopped. After what felt like forever, a police car finally pulled over. The officer rolled down his window and gave us a look like we were a bunch of kids who'd gotten in over our heads. "Y'all lost?" he asked, sounding both amused and concerned. We nodded, explaining everything, and when we gave him Ben's address, he let out a low whistle. "You boys really wandered off, didn't you? Cedar Falls is a good ways back." We climbed into the back of the police car, exhausted but grateful, and as he drove us back to Ben's place, he started talking. "You know," he said, almost like he was thinking out loud, "you need to be careful in these woods. There's some interesting folks around these parts. Some folks say there's still a few old witch families in those hills. People who don't take kindly to strangers." The rest of the ride was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. I kept thinking about that church, the way those people stared at us, and that gas station attendant who somehow knew where we'd been without us even saying a word. When we finally got back to Ben's, his parents were beside themselves with worry. They thanked the officer and gave us all an earful about being careful. That night, as we lay on the floor of Ben's room, none of us said a word. I think we all had the same thought that whatever we'd stumbled into back there, it was something we weren't meant to find. Those empty eyes in the church, that silent group watching us leave, the strange directions from the man at the gas station, it all felt like a bad dream. But the thing was, I knew I'd never forget it, no matter how much I wanted to. And every now and then, when I'm alone and it's dark, I think back to that night in Cedar Falls, and I can still feel those eyes on me, watching from the shadows. There I was, around 14 or maybe 15, and, skating was my whole life. Weekends? Those were all about freedom on wheels, baby. We'd go for hours, sometimes until the sun started dipping low, painting the sky with streaks of fiery orange and pink. Skating was everything back then, my escape, my way of feeling like I had the whole world under my feet, even if it was just some cracked city pavement. One weekend night, just like 100 other nights, I was downtown with my crew. It started off the same, cruising through the streets, showing off tricks, pushing each other to go just a bit harder, But as the hours slipped away, the group thinned out. People peeled off one by one, until finally it was just me, standing there with my board, watching my friends disappear into the night. It was getting late, probably 10, maybe 11 p.m. and I figured it was time to call it a night. So, after a last look at the city lights and a deep breath of that cool night air, I jumped on the bus headed home. None of my friends lived near me, so there I was, riding alone, my forehead against the window, watching the world blur by in streaks of light and shadow. Funny how a bustling city could feel so empty at night, almost like it was holding its breath. It was quiet, too quiet, like that eerie calm just before a storm. When the bus finally dropped me off, I found myself on this big street that ran east to west. The stop was just a couple minutes from home. Just a left turn and a short stroll down my quiet little block. I remember stepping off the bus, and as it rumbled off, the world felt oddly hushed behind me. So there I was, alone, the only sound my footsteps hitting the pavement, and a light breeze rustling the leaves above. As I got closer to the corner that would lead me home, something or someone caught my eye. Just ahead, from around the corner of the elementary school, a man on a bike rolled into view, seemingly out of nowhere. His silhouette cut against the dark, like he'd been carved out of the night itself. It was strange, seeing someone come out of that shadowy pathway, one that trailed near the old creek where nobody usually went after dark. I felt this tightness in my gut. I didn't know what it was, but something about him just didn't fit. Maybe it was the hour, or maybe it was the way he seemed to appear out of thin air. But all I knew was that the sight of him set off alarms in my head. I started walking a little faster, telling myself it was nothing, just some guy, but that feeling clung to me like a shadow. Then he yelled, "Hey!" The sound of it echoed sharp and loud, slicing through the quiet like a knife. I felt a jolt, the kind that shoots down your spine. And in that instant, every sense was on high alert. My heart was pounding, my legs felt stiff, like they wanted to run but weren't sure which way. It was almost funny in my mind. I could hear myself saying, "Relax, it's just some random guy." But I knew better. This wasn't just some random passerby. Something was off, and I could feel it in my bones. I didn't want him to know where I lived. My home was my safe place, the one spot in the world that was supposed to be mine, free from anything or anyone scary or strange. So I kept my head down and kept walking, picking up the pace a bit, hoping he'd just go away. But when I glanced over my shoulder, he was right there, closer than ever, his shadow stretching out under the streetlight, like it was reaching for me. And then he blocked my path. Right in front of the school, he stopped his bike, cutting me off. I was close enough to see him now, tall, older, maybe in his late 30s or 40s. Definitely not the kind of guy you'd expect to be cruising around on a bike at this hour, especially not in this neighborhood. He looked down at me, his eyes glazed, maybe drunk or something, and he slurred out, "Where you going?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my face steady, even though every instinct was screaming at me to bolt. "None of your business," I shot back, hoping that a little attitude might make him think twice. But it only made him grin. A slow, ugly kind of grin that made my skin crawl. My heart dropped. Those words. I felt my mind freeze, panic beginning to claw its way up my throat. All I could think about was getting away, but how? The street was dark and empty, and he was right in front of me, towering over me with that twisted grin. I could almost feel the weight of his eyes on me, sizing me up like a lion with a trapped animal. I tightened my grip on my skateboard, feeling its rough, familiar surface under my fingers, and for a moment I thought about swinging it. But he was huge. What if I missed? What if he just shrugged it off and got even angrier? My mind was racing, calculating every terrible scenario. It felt like I was drowning in fear, my chest heavy, my thoughts scattered. "Come on, kid," he muttered, stepping closer, his voice slurring. I tried to think of something to say, anything that would get me out of this, but my throat felt locked. I felt my hand trembling, gripping that skateboard like it was a lifeline. And then, in sheer desperation, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Nothing. The line was busy. It didn't feel real. That should never happen, right? It's 911. But I heard that busy tone clear as day, and the panic inside me skyrocketed. I looked around wildly, the street stretching out around me like an empty black void. All I could think was, I'm alone. There's no one here. No one to help me. That's when I noticed her, a figure down the street, moving slowly on the opposite sidewalk, maybe 70 feet behind me. An older woman, small and hunched, her steps slow and careful. I could barely believe it, but there she was, like a tiny flicker of hope in the dark. I didn't think. I just ran. The man yelled something behind me, but I didn't care. I bolted toward that woman, calling out for help, my voice shaky and desperate. As I got closer, I could see her looking at me with confusion, fear flashing in her eyes. She took a step back, her face tightening, obviously startled by some kid running at her in the middle of the night. She told me to stay away, her voice sharp with worry. But I was desperate. I begged her, trying to explain, feeling my voice crack. And then, as a last hope, I asked if she spoke Polish, a language I'd picked up from my family. She froze, her eyes widening with recognition, and she nodded slowly. In a rush, I spilled out my story, explaining everything in Polish, every word tumbling out in a frantic, jumbled mess. The moment she understood, her face softened, the fear melted away, and suddenly she was this rock of calm. She looked over my shoulder, and for a terrifying moment I thought she might walk away, leave me to deal with this on my own. But instead, she just stood there, facing that man with a strength I hadn't seen before. She glanced back at me and said in Polish, "Try the police again." I nodded, my hands shaking as I dialed once more, praying, please let it work this time. And as I dialed, I could see the man on the bike watching us. He must have sensed something was off. His face twisted, and he muttered something under his breath. Then, without another word, he turned his bike and rode off, disappearing down the street, swallowed up by the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. I got through to the police then, my voice barely more than a whisper as I told them what happened. They assured me they'd send someone to check the area, but as I looked around, the man was already long gone. When the woman asked if I was all right, I managed a shaky nod, finally feeling the adrenaline start to fade, leaving me exhausted and shaken. The police arrived shortly after. They didn't find him. Of course, whoever he was, he'd vanished like a bad dream by the time they got there. I thanked the woman as they drove me home, her presence that night still vivid in my mind, like an anchor holding me steady in the chaos. It was a night I'd never forget. For the first time, I truly understood what it felt like to be vulnerable, to realize that danger could lurk in the most familiar places, waiting in the shadows. And every now and then, when I walk that same street at night, I still find myself glancing over my shoulder, listening for the quiet whir of wheels on pavement, wondering if I'll ever see that bike again.